This episode is brought to you by Ground News.
We begin with the deal to raise the debt ceiling.
The agreement raises the debt ceiling until 2025.
It's not 100% what everybody wants, but when you look, the country is going to be stronger. This is going to be transformational.
Congress just passed an agreement to increase the debt ceiling. If you didn't hear about it after the big panic,
Congress has not prudently done its job. They're off the rails.
well, that's done now. Republicans and Democrats came to an agreement. They'll raise the debt ceiling for 2 more years, and in exchange, work requirements for food stamps and welfare are gonna get worse. There's gonna be a $1.5 trillion spending cut over the next 10 years, which will put a ton of strain on programs like affordable housing. New fossil fuel projects will have an easier time getting permits, meaning more pipelines, and you gotta love that. And of course, the student loan payment moratorium will be coming to an end. The government is just spending too much money, and we need to tighten our belts and make compromises. Except for the military, because it's just cool as hell. You guys get it, it's so sick. Man, it's awesome with all the guns and the tanks and the domestic spying and the... We gotta give those guys more money. At least $886 billion next year. 3% more than in 2023, if I had to randomly pick a number.
Do you maggots understand that?
Nothing we can do about it. It's just the coolest thing we can spend money on. Anyway, this whole episode is about government spending, which is a very familiar theme in American politics. With the 2024 election season starting, like every cycle, one of the things you'll inevitably hear is the "how are you going to pay for that?" question. Like with the debt ceiling stuff, this question will never come up for defense spending, obviously. That money is special and totally different and unrelated, and stop worrying about it, we've got hospitals to bomb, come on now. But over the next 14 or so months, every single progressive candidate proposing universal healthcare will, without fail, get scrutinized for their budgeting. Despite the fact it's estimated that universal healthcare would save Americans $450 billion a year, and, less importantly, tens of thousands of lives. But none of that matters. What matters is if it would create a budget deficit. More money going out than money coming in taxes, and therefore more debt. And this sucks. This selective scrutiny for progressive spending, I mean. It creates doubt in a lot of people's minds about the viability of good projects like free healthcare. And this doubt rarely ever gets resolved by the truth. The truth being that the government can absolutely afford these programs. More than afford. The government has a long list of good reasons to spend money like this, and almost no reason not to, as you'll see throughout this video. These questions about government spending create a lot of doubt, though, and keep us from embracing progressive policies we believe in, including me for a while. Social programs like free healthcare always sounded good to me, but they also sounded expensive. And for a long time, constantly being told that the government's spending so much already that the debt is in trillions of dollars made me believe we actively needed to give up on stuff like free healthcare and scale back our spending. And in short, no we don't. And in long, that's what the rest of the video is for. What I'd like to explain today is that government spending isn't a bad thing. There's no debt your kids will have to pay back, nor is it reckless spending by well-intentioned but ultimately kinda careless bureaucrats. We can afford to pay for social programs like universal healthcare, and welfare, and new infrastructure, and high-speed rail, and sustainable energy, because government spending is A, not funded by taxes, so more government spending doesn't mean less money in your pocket, and B, there is no hard limit on government spending so long as the government spends money on something. The real constraint on government spending isn't money, that it has in unlimited supply. The constraint is physical resources. It isn't more responsible to spend less because all that spending less means is not taking advantage of the resources at our disposal. It wouldn't cause massive problems if we spent more, because for a country like the US, which has something called currency sovereignty, increasing the national debt isn't the same thing as when you and I go into debt. It isn't even really debt at all. Let me explain. The federal government of the US has currency sovereignty. It has a fiat currency, meaning its currency isn't tied to anything like gold. And it issues debt mainly in said currency. When the government spends more than it taxes, this is called a deficit. This deficit is a gap the government fills, at the moment, through debt. And the US gets this debt by selling bonds. This is easily the most confusing part of the video, so bear with me for a second. What are bonds? Well, the private sector lends the US money. and in return, the US issues them an IOU, a bond that the government promises to pay back with interest at a later date, maybe 5, 10, 15 years later. The government doesn't really need this money. Remember, it can print more at any time because it has a fiat currency, so this is less of an actual loan and more of a savings account for the private sector. A risk-free asset that the government lets people, mostly the wealthy, store some of their money in. But anyway, these bonds are held by a lot of people, including some foreign governments. But the vast majority are held by Americans, the government itself, and the Federal Reserve, which will often buy back bonds as a way to introduce more currency into the economy. We call this debt. But it's more like an accounting system for the government and a way for it to give some value to its currency, by making sure people want to store their wealth in dollars instead of something else. Unlike you and me, the government will always be able to pay this debt back, to return the money on the IOUs it created, because it's issued everything in dollars which the government can produce in unlimited supply. The government can never go bankrupt. It's not waiting for more gold to come in or something. The government debt is just a way the government monitors and holds onto a part of the money supply. If that was a little technical and complicated, here's a more practical way to think about it. Governments spend first and tax later. They create money and then they destroy some of it with taxes. You already knew that. We all know that governments create money. Without the government, there would be no dollars because somebody needs to print them out, or credit bank accounts with digital dollars. And you and me, we're just not allowed to do that. But we often forget this fact when it comes to government spending. We know that governments are responsible for money creation, and yet most of our lives, we're told that the government gets a big pile of money through taxes and then spends some of it, and that's how federal budgeting works. But that's not true. They spend first by creating money and spending it somewhere, and then they tax later according to how much they need to. Why are taxes part of this process? Well, the government has a rule. We all need to pay our taxes in dollars. No one's allowed to do it in Bitcoin or elegantly crafted poems, no matter how moving they may be. So people need dollars for their taxes, which the government gives them, sometimes by buying bonds, or more directly by funding new projects. That money goes from one business to another and eventually ends up in your pocket as your paycheck, and that way you can pay your taxes. This process of creation and taxation allows the government to fund projects, generate demand and value for its currency, and ultimately control the money supply in its economy. Now that you understand that, things get a bit more complicated. In practice, the government doesn't create all the money itself. It lets private banks do most of it, and it's mostly happy just kind of monitoring what's going on. When a private business gets loans from a bank, that bank isn't taking money from your savings and giving it to the business owner. It's creating new money out of thin air. And the government is cool with some private banks doing this so long as they follow a couple rules and the economy works the way the government wants it to. Money is created out of thin air all the time. Instead of letting private banks create new money, more government spending is just the federal government funding things itself instead of private businesses taking out loans. It's why when we say that the government could fund universal healthcare, infrastructure, the Green New Deal, whatever, it's true. The same way private banks could fund basically anything so long as the government doesn't call them a counterfeiter. There are no financial constraints when you can create and destroy money at will. So, what's the limit? Well, the only real constraint you have to consider is what economists call the real economy. There's money, and then there's the real economy, the actual resources that this new money can be spent on. In the case of universal healthcare, for example, the government would be paying doctors and nurses' salaries, the salaries of the workers who make medical equipment, pills, and other pharmaceuticals, the hospital's electricity bills, and all the other things that keep medical centers running. The real constraints on what a government can do aren't coming from the budget. Remember, the budget is infinite. The constraints are the real-world resources at its disposal. When the government isn't spending on healthcare like this, either the private sector will and profiteer, or those resources will go unused. This is the reason government spending doesn't break everything. Because when new money is created, it's to do new stuff. The money supply grows, but so does the real economy, which government spending mobilizes. When the government funds a new endeavor, it's getting more use out of the resources available, and therefore having more money floating around isn't a problem. But I know you're thinking about inflation, because we're often told that inflation happens when the government spends too much, but that's not true either. Countries like Japan, for example, have some of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world, and still the country can't get out of deflation. More government spending does not automatically lead to inflation or hyperinflation. All it really takes for inflation to happen is for enough businesses to start raising their prices. Your grocery store might raise their prices, if they're a market leader, for example, and you will feel the pain of inflation without the government having changed the money supply at all. Businesses that can't change their prices like this, either because they're in a more competitive market or can't move their prices as fast, will simply lose profits and might even go under. We tend to think of inflation as everything getting more expensive, and having more money in the economy seems like it would cause that. But if everything did get more expensive at once, inflation wouldn't be a problem. If everything suddenly got more expensive, your salary would automatically go up too. It's because things move asymmetrically in the real world that inflation is so devastating, and all it takes is a few businesses leveraging their market position for it to happen. If anything, government spending on something like universal healthcare might even be deflationary. In all likelihood, it would lower the prices of health insurance and your prescriptions by cutting out the profits for the middlemen of the private insurance world. I'll say it again. Government spending has nothing to do with inflation. And in the real world, almost all cases of hyperinflation didn't happen because of more money printing, but as the result of productive capacity collapsing or an over-reliance on foreign currency, not government spending. Taken all together, this is why the government has this kind of liberty to spend. This framework of understanding money creation and destruction, generally referred to as modern monetary theory, or MMT, is why more spending, and even more debt, is fine. So long as the government finds something to spend money on, it can do it. It already does this anytime the Pentagon comes running for more money, or during the pandemic when the Fed injected $5 trillion into the economy. The problem with government spending is profit. In a capitalist economy, the prime directive that private business owners are operating under is profit-making. The more the government finances directly, which it can do without worrying about profit and only focusing on the real-world outcomes, the less private businesses can extract profit from that thing. If the government spends on healthcare, a private business can't and therefore won't get the opportunity to skim a little off the top. Business owners also don't like getting taxed. This approach to government spending partly relies on the ability of governments to delete money. Business owners, who accumulate money by paying their workers less than what they bring in for the company, would very much like to keep that stolen wealth and don't care at all about public projects that benefit everybody. So they lobby governments and pay accountants to find ways to not pay taxes and store their wealth somewhere else. Even when they are taxed, because these capitalists, these business owners are in charge of setting prices and wages, any taxation on businesses can often just be passed on to workers and consumers through price hikes, wage cuts, extended hours, lower benefits, and on and on. And these here are the limits of MMT and the point where a little Marxism comes in. MMT accurately describes the power of the government to spend, but it doesn't take into account the power of the capitalist class to be upset about it. And in a class society like ours, that's a problem. The government can't go bankrupt. It can spend money on all sorts of cool stuff, but when it does, it has to get its permission slip signed by the ruling class first. If anything it does gets in the way of profit, the big chunk of money that only a few people get to keep, it will only do it if there's fire in the streets and it doesn't have a choice. The government can feed the homeless, free people of debt, fund renewable energy, reduce working hours by law without cutting pay. But these kinds of things suck for profit seekers. They're great for humanity, but they're terrible for capitalists. The small percentage of humanity that benefits when people are forced to work and buy at an inflated price. Universal healthcare is great. It might even save businesses money, but it makes workers less desperate. And that small percentage of business owners has the power and the wealth to stop the kind of spending that would make people less desperate. I'll summarize this video another way. Take away the need for profit. Take away the power of the ruling class. In short, take away capitalism. And the only limit to doing cool stuff becomes the resources available. We have the doctors for universal healthcare, the housing for free homes, the farms to feed everyone, the machines for infrastructure, the technology to switch away from fossil fuels. We can spend on these resources and bring them into action. Let workers control the economy democratically, and the new money we create can be spent well without the need to enrich the middleman. We don't need to worry about how we're going to pay for that. There are plenty of resources in our economy waiting to be used for the betterment of people's lives. The only obstacle left is how much improving people's lives costs the capitalist ruling class. Okay, I understand that this is a horribly complicated topic that probably doesn't make much sense at first. In about 15 minutes, I've tried to explain something that is in complete contradiction with how most of us are told government spending works our entire lives. So I'm sure this short video will have left you with more questions than answers. To help, I've left a few videos and books in the description to help you learn more about this topic. Specifically, I want to highlight One Dime's 2 fantastic videos on taxation and government deficits. They were my introduction to this topic, and One Dime was kind enough to answer an unreasonable amount of my questions to make the video you just watched accurate. So please, show him some love. This is a really interesting and complex topic, and funnily enough, government spending is one thing that both wings of the American two-party corporate duopoly agree on. So I just want to take a second and show you what that looks like with today's sponsor, Ground News. Here we have 3 examples of news coverage of the rise in American poverty. One from the right, one from the corporate center, and one from what most Americans would consider the left. Notice how each article picks a convenient scapegoat. For the right, it's Joe Biden's fault. For the left, it's Joe Manchin's fault. And for the center, it's thanks to COVID. Regardless of where these outlets place the blame, in each case, their conclusion is that this is just how the system works, and that government spending can't solve the problem of poverty, or would even make it worse. As we've seen in this video, that's simply not the case. The government can spend money on whatever it wants, and the endless pearl clutching about the deficit is just a convenient excuse not to improve things for the average person. As with anything, the key here is to recognize who benefits from this kind of coverage. And Ground News goes a long way towards helping the reader understand what interests are funding each of these outlets. This is something I get asked about a lot. How do I help parents or friends break out of their little propaganda bubble? It's great to analyze rhetoric like this, examining wording to look for bias and determining who's behind each outlet, but that's a lot of work and none of us have time for that. That's why I always recommend people check out Ground News, because it has a ton of really useful tools to make building media literacy skills a lot easier. Ground News is a web and mobile app that aggregates over 50,000 news sources and offers intuitive, easy to understand comparison tools, so you can do things like what we did here. See how a particular story is being spun by various interests. You can also see the political leaning, factuality rating, and ownership of every single news source right in the app. No tedious research required. Now, full disclosure, as a socialist, I obviously disagree with the placement of some of these outlets. For example, I don't think CNN should be placed as far left as it is. But honestly, this might be a good thing when trying to educate your friends and family. If you come at them with, well, actually, CNN is a right-wing network, they're not going to take you seriously. Ground News is the perfect first baby step towards media literacy. If you're looking for a way to give your friends and family a great set of tools to understand media bias, who it serves, and how to spot it, I highly recommend you check out Ground News at the link below. And if you really like it, they're currently offering a 30% discount for their Vantage subscription to all Second Thought viewers. You can only redeem the discount at ground.news/secondthought, so be sure to click the link below. It really does help support me and Second Thought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other work by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.